All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to start here momentarily. If you could make sure your cell phones are silenced or turned off, and council members, just ensure your microphones are turned on. Got to make sure I'm reading the right one here. All right, today is Monday, November 13th, 2023. It is 6 p.m. Today's a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council, but before we begin our regular legislative meeting, we do have individual committee meetings this evening, and we will start with City Properties, Parks, and Recreation.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Properties, Park Recreation meeting at 6 o'clock, November 13th, Education Council Chambers. All members present, including myself as chair, Mr. Heidick and Mrs. Fry, and all council members also noted, and guests. We have one requested legislation, a memo from Stacy Carr requesting legislation allowing the mayor to sell various city-owned properties, parcel 0107106, parcel 0107105, and parcel 0107368. The property sale price will follow Barberton Land Bank guidelines. Any questions, remarks? Has everybody looked at those? Two of them are in your ward, Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Right there on Van Buren. Any questions or remarks? Council? All right, motion please.
I'll make a motion to call for it.
I will second that.
And vote please.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We have one pending. Mr. Daniel Miller, City of Barberton Park Commission, to begin 1/1/2024 for a 6-year term. Six year or 4 year? The date says 27.
I think that's 4 years, isn't it?
That is 4 years. Yeah,
For
because it's
4 year?
January 1st. That would be 4 years.
Okay.
All right, so we'll correct that. It's a 4-year term. And then it's ending 12/31/2027. Any questions on that? Thank you. Any miscellaneous discussion for city properties? Seeing none? All right, thank you. Motion to adjourn, please.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I will second that.
Mr. Heidi, can we adjourn at 6:02? That passed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Next up is Public Welfare and Safety with Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is 6:03 p.m. We are in council chambers. I am bringing the Public Welfare and Safety meeting to order. It is Monday, November 13th. All members of the committee are here, which is myself as chair, Mr. Griffin, and Mrs. Coburn as members of the committee. All other council members are also present, as well as guests as noted on my sheet. We have no request for legislation. We have no pending legislation. And I will open it up for miscellaneous discussion if anybody has anything in regard to public welfare and safety.
I have nothing.
Nothing? Anyone from the gallery? Nothing? Hearing nothing, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I'll second.
Motion made by Mr. Griffin and seconded by Mrs. Coburn, and we are adjourned at 6:04 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fry. Rules, Marketing, and Development, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to call this meeting to order today, November 13th. Excuse me, we are in council chambers. All members of the MIC committee are present, and all others noted. Tonight, we have no request for legislation. Do we have any miscellaneous discussion for rules, marketing, and development? In the gallery or from the body? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
I will second that.
Thank you, Heidi. We are adjourned at 6:55.
Next up, City Utilities, Mrs. Copeland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call City Utilities to order at 6:05 PM. We have all members present and those as noted on my sheet. We have no request for legislation. We have no pending legislation. Is there any miscellaneous discussion for utilities? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
We are adjourned at 6:06.
All right, Finance and Personnel, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance and Personnel, it is 6:05, Monday, November 13th, 2023. The committee is present, which consists of Councilors Coburn, Thompson, President Greer, and myself as chair. All others are noted. Requests for legislations are reserved for committee of the whole nights. So next is the presentation of the October financial reports. Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Starting off with the health insurance fund, or the healthcare fund. In the month of October, our revenues were just shy of $410,000. Expenditures just shy of $358,000. Our unexpended fund balance is $1,736,000. Our net year-to-date is about negative $670, but that should get out of the negative over the next month or so. Moving on to the income tax fund, our estimates for the month of October were just shy of $1,060,000. Our actuals came in at just shy of $1,340,000. We did transfer the final bit of money from the income tax fund to the general fund, so all the transfers are done for the year out of the income tax fund. Looking at it, our actuals were up about $300,000 over our estimate for this month, and for the year, we're about over just shy of $2.4 million over our estimate for the year, which is all good. Moving on to the statement of cash receipts and disbursements, a couple funds in the negative, and it's the usual ones. The first one is going to be the FEMA fund. You'll notice that negative number did jump though from last month to this month. That just has to deal with the grant for the dam project going on. We had to open up, you guys just passed the appropriation a couple weeks ago for a little over $800,000. So they did open that PO so we can pay the design group that's doing that work for us. And we'll get reimbursed. I think we've received 1 or 2 reimbursements so far from FEMA for that. The next one in the negative is the CDBG fund, which is our federal HUD program. Once again, once we do the expenditures, we can get reimbursed for that. And those are the only 2 funds in the negative currently. Moving on to the last 3 months of activity, you'll notice the general fund went up by about $500,000. Special revenue funds have stayed about the same. Enterprise funds have stayed about the same. All other funds did increase by about $170,000. Unencumbered cash balance from the past couple months to this month did increase by almost $1 million from last month to this month. Looking at the prior year, October 22 to October 23, you'll notice the general fund cash balance has decreased by about $4.5 million. Special revenue funds is up by about $2 million. Enterprise funds down by about $1 million. And then all other funds is down about $60,000. And if you look at last year compared to this year, you will see that our unencumbered cash balance is down by about $3.5 million. Any questions?
Mr. Baker, how close are we to being what we were before we invented it?
I would have to look, but we're about right where I'm pretty sure we're about right where we were. Yeah. So prior to BMW leaving, I want to say we're about even where we're at right now. I would have to double check that though.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Director. Do I have a motion to call for the approval?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Right. Pending legislation, 143, 2023, transfer of funds law department, ordinance transferring $60,000 from the income tax fund to the unappropriated item of the general fund and declaring emergency. Do we have any questions? 144, 2023, appropriation law department, an ordinance appropriating $60,000 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the law department's operation and maintenance budget and declaring an emergency. Any comments, questions? 146, 2023, enter into contract with Regional Income Tax Agency Legal Program, ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with Regional Income Tax Agency, RITA, Legal Program for collection purposes and declaring an emergency. Do we have any comments here? 147, 2023, amending Chapter 880 Barberton Codified Ordinances, an ordinance to amend Chapter 880 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Barberton regarding municipal income tax. Any comments? 148, Appropriation Fire Department, an ordinance appropriating $1,058.12 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the fire department's operating budget and declaring an emergency. Any comments? 149, 2023, enter into contract direct indictment program, an ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with the direct indictment program of Summit County in the amount of $21,000 and declaring an emergency. Any comments? 150, 2023, Appropriation Law Department, an ordinance appropriating $22,064 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the Law Department's operation and maintenance budget and declaring an emergency. Any comments? 151, 2023, Authorized Payment Direct Indictment Program, an ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to the Direct Indictment Program of Summit County in the amount of $22,064 and declaring an emergency. Any comments? 152, 2023, Appropriation Police Department, an ordinance appropriating $148,000 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the police department's personnel service budget of the general fund and declaring an emergency. Any comments? 153, 2023, enter into contract Summit County Health, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into a one-year contract with Summit County for the Summit County Health Connection for employee benefits, which include medical and prescription coverage beginning January 1st, 2024 through December 31st, 2024, and declaring an emergency. Are there any comments? Right. On the third reading tonight, Resolution 129, 2023, grant application. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton support and authorize the mayor to apply to the Barberton Community Foundation for a grant in the amount of $1,600,000 annually for 25 years. Does anybody like to speak on this? Seeing none.
Are you going
Counselor?
to amend this, or we're just going to vote on it as it is?
I'm comfortable moving forward. I don't see any other conversation. There hasn't been any other conversation in the past few weeks.
We had lengthy conversation where numerous people on council had suggested different numbers, and you continued with this number. So I don't want it to be on the record that we didn't have conversation. We had very lengthy conversation regarding this, so I think that's why she was asking.
In the last couple committee meetings, I'd asked for comments and there were none.
I still stand the same that I did when we talked the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, because
Counselor?
there was only 2 yes votes that pulled out of committee. that was my problem. I wanted to hold it for a week because this is huge and you had 2 yes votes. That was it. And I believe one of those yes votes, a couple weeks later, then changed their mind. So I just feel that something this detrimental, and you can pull out a committee with 2 yes votes. There was only 4 people, no, 3 people on the committee, 1 was absent. And I have to agree with
Erica.
that we did have lengthy conversation, but you were quick to say, we're going to amend at 1.6, even though there was a few of us that said no, and 2 votes pulled it out.
I thought we were amending it to 600,000.
At 600,000 as a minimum, I still believe that's an undue burden on the citizens to raise their water and sewer instantly, to saddle our general fund for 25 years at 219,000, which, in conversation with Director Flaker this morning, in 2019, we were in such a dire shape that we did indeed come close to laying off 4 firefighters, verified through the director. Not only that, but we finished that year above minimum fund balance totals by, what was it, Director, $7,381?
I think it's $7,200 in the budget.
So, to me, there is, I don't see being able to ask for less and still be able to maintain the city with the services we have without making horrifying sacrifices and placing, increases on utility bills, which the council would have no say on, neither would voters. They can raise it up to 5% without our approval. It's 5% right away. What's going to happen in year 2, year 3, year 12, year 20? I don't see that as a good use of enterprise money from water and sewer that's not being plugged back into water and sewer projects. Councilor Fry, you have had that Taylor Road project in your sights for a long time. We were able to pay for that, or at least pay for
No, we got a
percentage.
grant. We got a grant.
For 100%?
No, it's like 80%.
But we still had to
grant.
come up with 20%, and
Right.
luckily, we could do that. I just fear that projects forward such as that would be hard-pressed to find the 20% when so many citizens are going to benefit on Taylor Road and beyond. Counselor?
So by doing this, the foundation has no requirements to give us a dime.
Correct.
And the discussions were at 600,000. We already know from rumors on the street that they don't have it to do it. So why do we think that pushing this for 160,000 is going to it's going to set us so far back in negotiations that nothing will happen anyway?
I don't feel the foundation has brought this up because I don't see how they could. Have they received a grant request for this?
Well, this is the grant request.
Then I find it hard pressed that they could have discussions without it in front of them. We have it in front of us, they don't have it in front of them.
Go ahead, you go ahead.
This is the same conversation we had several weeks ago.
Mhm.
It was a matter of, I think it was Mr. Jaber had asked Mr. Flaker, what would be a number that would be more attainable? I think it was 900,000. We had talked about it, and then we ended the conversation with you saying, no, it's $1.6 million, and that is what it is going to be. So this is the same conversation we had before. We would love to put this in front of them with a more attainable number. You're just going to the absolute highest number, which they're going to probably say
Reject.
no. We're going to be back at square one. This is what I said. It's going to be drawn out for weeks and weeks and weeks. If we would just approach them with a more attainable number.
Director, was it 950,000 that would alleviate the general fund's contribution, yet still need to pull the other money from the enterprise funds?
One want to say it was, I think I said somewhere between 8 and 900,000, because the initial ask was what, 600,000, I think was the original legislation request. If I'm remembering the spreadsheet correctly, I don't have it in front of me, I want to say, and I think you mentioned just a little bit ago, 219,000 out of the general fund. So 600 plus 219, 819,000. So, I mean, that would be no general fund money coming out at that point in time, so.
And that would still have the courts contributing, which are they bound to contribute the 200,000 that was in the spreadsheet?
They're not bound to it.
So they could easily say, at any point, we're not giving that.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, they have no obligation to fund municipal building or a new courthouse. It falls on the city that the court falls in. It's their responsibility. It doesn't fall back on the courts.
So let's assume that they say no. That puts us just over $1 million, which still has us touching enterprise funds, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Counselor?
I just wanted to bring up that we had all gotten a letter from the Community Foundation, and if that didn't spell it out, that they can't do it, I don't know what will. So the reason I was asking is you're still going to put it forward so that we can all vote that we don't want to make a grant request. That's basically what I was saying. And also, there was a great letter to the editor this week by David Wynn, who is on the Planning Commission and also Friends of the Foundation, and he said why it was such a bad idea.
Yeah, I did read that letter, Counselor. There's a couple of us I know that support this on council, and that letter called our approach, quote, craven, and it also went to the links of, he said the supporters of it were also, quote, what was that, Counselor Thompson? Blatantly dishonest, I believe he called us, and lacking political courage. Those are quotes from that. And I'm going to ask you, since you brought that letter up, have I said anything in these discussions that would be considered blatantly dishonest? In your opinion? I don't judge either way, but in your opinion, has any statistic or any number I said been blatantly dishonest?
Well, I don't know where the 1.6 million came from, and I'm not saying that anything that you said was dishonest. I think you are trying to make something happen for the municipal building. However, I don't think the foundation is our answer. And I think that rather than just having conversations with the foundation, we have to have internal conversations about what we could do, what other avenues we could take to fund such a project. And that's all I'm saying about it. And I had said from the beginning I wouldn't vote for 1.6, and I also thought that 600,000 was a big ask.
So, I have not been blatantly
No,
dishonest.
but I did not say.
You referenced the letter, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows there were other aspects of that letter too, not just the glowing parts, but also to call people out as being in such a state that I don't believe in. I think everything we have said, I've said, everybody in here has said, has been very truthful. I don't think there's one person in this body that has said anything that would be considered dishonest to our voters. And if anybody disagrees with me, please raise your hand, because every single person here has been correct in what they've said. But I don't put stock into people's letters that accuse us of being dishonest, craven, and politically cowards.
The reason I brought it up is that he has been a part of the foundation and a part of planning and a part of a lot of Barberton, moving forward in one way or another. And it was his opinion that the funds from the Barberton Community Foundation were better suited for other projects within the city that would benefit more people. That's the reason I brought it up. And And I also brought up the letter from the foundation, which we all got, and I think that they pretty much mapped that out as to why they cannot participate.
Thank you. Council,
Thank you. I felt as though no matter what figure that we might have put together, was it going to change you from changing it to 1.6? Mr. Jaber, he made different announcements. I said something about why 25 years. It was 1.6, and that's what it stood at. And I don't know if you had a deaf ear to the rest of us, what we were talking about and what we were saying. I even suggested that you personally, as chair of finance committee for the city, meet with the foundation and go over this stuff, and then you bring it back to us. You bring it back to where 600,000 wasn't what it needed to be. It needed to be 1.6, and that didn't happen. And I believe the next week when Joyce was back, she asked to amend it back to 600,000, and it was nope, not going to do that, 1.6. So I think that it wasn't. I think we could have got a little bit more in depth with that, and I think that I wish that we would have had a workshop, even if the foundation couldn't have been here. I think enough of us here could have had a workshop and sat down and tore this thing apart and find out what we can do, what we can't do. I just think that it was 1.6, and you didn't really, like I said, pulled out a committee with 2 yes votes. So it wasn't really, it was like, we'll talk about it after it pulls out of committee, and I think now that we're at this third reading and nothing still has been done or any challenges or anything of that sort, I think now we're to the point where, we have to make that decision. And I understand Mrs. Peters when she was talking about, she's the interim executive director, and that 25 years at $1 million, that's a lot of money. That's $41 million. And, you don't want a new executive coming in and saying, oh my gosh, what happened here? That all has to be, it all has to be worked together. We all have to be on the same page, or we have to be able to look at this. I think everybody here, everybody in the audience understands that the courts need this building, and we need a municipal building. That's been something talked about, 30 years ago that we need one. But I think by being so one-sided and being to where this is what we need, I think we have to negotiate. Just like a contract with police and fire and ASME, we have to negotiate. We have to give and take. And unfortunately, it's just not a good time at the end of the year trying to rush this through. And rushing through, I'm saying not having the extra time. It's 3 readings and we're stuck with that. But I think the foundation is there to help us in any way that they possibly can, and have numerous different and different variations. But you don't want to take scholarships away from children. You don't want to take programs that are good to this community, so we can have a municipal building. So, and when you said something about the 20% on Taylor Road, that comes from issue 8. Issue 8, that's for streets. So that doesn't, that money set aside for street improvement. So I just wish that, we had some workshops before this all came down to the last reading today. That's my opinion, and only my opinion. Thank you.
thank you. I wasn't aware that issue 8, was that able to cover the water lines that we're doing in there as well?
No,
Okay.
that was covered by a grant, the water lines.
Counselor, I saw your hand up next.
Yeah, thank you. And then I just wanted to point out, I don't know if you saw Mrs. Peters had her hand up
Yes.
as well. So when this was first brought out of committee, I was in favor of asking for the 1.6 million. But at that time, I didn't know what the total cost of this project was going to be. And I don't think any of us did. We just had the request for 600,000. First time we saw any sort of plans was at that meeting. So for me to say, well, it doesn't hurt to ask, I'm thinking, look what they did with the high school, right? But then we received this letter explaining this is why this isn't possible. I still am not comfortable with the residents having to foot the bill for this. I mean, we've put how many levies on the ballot that have failed to support our safety forces and things like that. I feel like the voters, if we put it on them through their water bill, sewer, they're not going to have a say in it, and that's not fair. And I'm not comfortable with doing that. But I also think that we just need to go back to the drawing board on this. It's kind of silly to make a decision without having a meeting, and I do appreciate Mrs. Peters showing up this evening, but I think we should pull it.
Thank you.
Does this microphone work?
Yeah, that's on too.
Good evening. Thank you for giving me a few moments to speak. Just one thing I wanted to say before you do talk about a vote on this. I appreciate all of your comments and your attention to the information that we shared with you. Throughout this process, throughout this year, I have been in conversation with the mayor. To his credit, he was working on feasibility and ideas with us to see what we could make happen. And he brought to council the 600,000, at least 600,000 request, and that allows us to continue those conversations and look for other ideas and other types of funding and other sources so that the future generations who might benefit from the foundation aren't affected and the general funds aren't affected. We can explore other ideas if we have at least that base to start. That's where that came from, and I'd like you to know that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor?
Thank you. I appreciate all the comments and discussion tonight and over the weeks. Mr. Flaker is correct. There's no statutory legal requirement for the courts to pay towards this, but they've been a part of this since day one, going back to 2012 and before that. And you've had changes, right, in personnel, and they've still stayed at the table and been a part of this. So, again, no legal obligation, but they have been a part of this. This may be a question for the law director, but I believe in the past the council has held the third reading for another 2 weeks. So I don't know if that's an option that council wants to entertain. Again, I believe that happened in the past, but
We can hold, can't we?
hold the third reading for another 2 weeks.
But I think there's
Have to happen today.
I didn't hear the director back
She
there.
said she's not aware of that.
Yeah, third. I know first.
I don't know that to be a rule.
I don't know if it's a rule, but. So, but, I think there's a lot of discussion that has happened. I know there's been a lot of discussion that has happened. We've got a meeting set up to discuss this a little further. I know that you've been trying to get a meeting put together, and the foundation has had pre-scheduled meetings already for some of their operations. The city started looking at this in 1958. We are closer now than ever before. And I get it, there's never been a perfect time when everyone's swimming in money and there's all this money to do whatever. It's never been like that, right? So we've been looking at scenarios and how do we make this happen. And so we're not done. We're still looking at that. This is an important decision. And that's why I tailored or wrote the legislation request as I did to give some flexibility. So just keep that in mind as you guys move forward.
Thank you. Mr. President?
Thank you. I'm looking for the rule that the mayor mentioned. But I did want to point out, Mrs. Peters tapped on this. They can't even formally have a conversation until a piece of legislation is in front of them. So whether this goes forward and they say no or not, I mean, it doesn't mean but they can't formally talk about things, and that's why she mentioned the 600,000 gave them room to have those negotiations without saying no.
Right.
This might go in front of them, they can say things, but there's no room for them to work with the city if they know they can't do one, so the only thing left for them to say is no. Wanted to point that out, and if I may, we did have a public comment
By all means.
through the stream. This is from Mr. Irwin, is that who that was?
Yes, she had a follow-up comment.
Mrs.
You go ahead and I'll do the
Okay, commented saying that we need foundation members to discuss, not rumors, this was explained in the Gazette. And to that point, we can't, it's rumors until they see a piece of legislation in front of them to even discuss it formally, you know.
And then she followed up after Mrs. Thompson was speaking, that says she agreed with her, take time and discuss further.
Okay, but I just wanted to point that out, so, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Counselor?
Can we amend this on the floor to the 600,000 so they can have a discussion? So we can vote yes to present it to them? Because as it stands at 1.6, we're going to vote no.
Director?
Look, you can vote no. You can vote no, not have a request, and then start over. Or you can vote yes and send the request forward. They don't have a request. So all the discussions that have been going on before can continue to go on, because they definitely have went on without a request. Right?
Correct.
So if you want to put a formal request forward that has passed a committee, you can do that, or you can vote no, but it's a third reading. And I've been here for all the meetings. There were 6 weeks of committee of the whole and legislative, and everyone had the opportunity to participate. So it was 6 weeks, 3 readings, non-emergency. So that's the choice before you.
Thank you, Director. My fear is amending it to 600,000, passing it, and that being what it is, that being cleared by the foundation, now we're stuck with the scenario of losing general fund money for 25 years, plus the enterprise funds. Counselor?
I think that the statements are that they want to continue to look for other avenues to help fund the shortages. It's not an end-all to be-all. There's other opportunities where there might be other associations that they can reach out to help us, not take it and put the burden on the people, that there are other opportunities to look into.
Thank you. Director, was there, oh, I'm sorry. Oh. Director, was there an alternative that you had discussed?
I mean, I mentioned this alternative. I know I talked to Tiffany about it. I talked to the mayor about it. There is another alternative that I did come up with. I know Tiffany said she was going to talk to Jason Slater about it, see if it is feasible with the foundation. That proposal that was in front of you on that spreadsheet was assuming debt service. And in the scenario that was outlined in the original grant request, a minimum of 600,000. Even when foundation members came and spoke the one night, they were saying how at 1.6 million they would have to book the full amount year one of $40 million. So assuming that logic, they would have to book the full amount of 15 million, which would be the 600,000 over the course of 25 years. They would have to book 15 million. It was brought up about prudent spending, where prudent spending is 5% of the original gift or the fair market value original gift, which 15 million is more than the 5% in that scenario as well. So I threw out there an idea to save everyone money in this scenario, save the city money from the standpoint if it would pass with and mind you, this 600,000, even if it's passed at 600,000, there's nothing locking us into this.
Right.
Because I still have to issue debt. If it doesn't make financial sense to the city, I'm not going to issue the debt. I mean, it's as simple as that. So let's get that out of the way. We're not talking about issuing debt here. This is just a grant request to the foundation. But back to my original point, to save the city money in interest and in what's in front of you guys today, the 1.6 million, which in this scenario would save the foundation money and interest, there's a possibility of being able to do this project without issuing any debt service. My reason behind it was if they have to book the full amount, and I know Tiffany said she was going to look into a few things, why not change the request to $20 million? And $20 million up front. I know it's a large ask still. However, at $20 million, it makes us not have to issue any debt. If you look at the total cost of the project, the total cost of the project was 29 million on that spreadsheet. I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me, apologize. But the total cost of the project was 29 million. At that cost, between what we have in lost revenue money from the ARPA funds, what we have already contributed, what the courts are bringing to the table, the city has roughly $8-9 million of money. So we just needed another 20 million to get the project funded. At that point in time, no debt service is being issued, which in this scenario is about an $18 to $19 million savings on the interest rate that's being assumed for this bond issuance. So, I mean, I did throw that idea out there, a way to save interest all around, save the city, citizens, foundation interest all the way around here. Like I said, I presented it to the mayor, I presented it to Tiffany, presented it to some of you on council. So it was just an idea, just that I threw out there, just a way to save interest entirely. So then we don't even have to issue any bonds on this project. It would just be paying cash for the whole thing and being done and over with it. So, and I mean, I even said possibly even structure this in a way to spread it out over multiple years, because let's face it, the project's not going to get done in 1 year. Probably the soonest anything can get started on the first Merrick building would probably be a year or so by the time we get everything sorted out there. So we wouldn't have to really start making any payments to any contractors until probably a year and a half, 2 years from now. And then they wouldn't start this building until the other building's done and they get the administration out of here. So you wouldn't be looking at the start of this building probably another 3 to 4 years from now. So, I mean, I even threw out there like even a staggered approach at this $20 million to help ease the burden on the foundation as well. Like I said, I presented those ideas. I haven't heard anything back. So I do know, like the mayor said, he has a meeting set up. So maybe we can discuss that in the upcoming meeting here in a few weeks on that idea. So.
Thank you, Director. Are there any more comments? Seeing none. Next up is the appointment to the Barberton Civil Service Commission. Michael Anderson to begin 1/1/2024 for a 6-year term, ending 12/31/2029. That'll be voted tonight. Is there any miscellaneous discussion? Mr. President?
You have full knowledge
tonight with all these pieces of legislation, that's all.
I've got my tea. Seeing nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:45.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our individual committee meetings for this evening. We're going to take a 10-minute break and come back for our regular legislative meeting.
Made vegetable beef soup for me, and it's made English.
All right, we're going to begin here
They
momentarily.
use different spices.
Please ensure your cell phones are off on silent, and council members, just ensure your microphones are turned on. I did forget to mention earlier that the gentleman back there that no one knows who it is Mr. Dave Polachek. His mustache is...
He shaved. Yeah, he did. That's what it was.
He did walk past me, and I didn't know who it was for like 10 seconds.
It took me a second when he was sitting over there. I'm like,
Still
wait
has
a
the bald
second.
He still has the bald head.
He's mad.
We love you.
Still has the bald head.
I knew it was him.
Yeah.
You had that gut feeling. Huh?
No, I just heard his voice. I wasn't
All right. Today is Monday, November 13th, 2023. I call this meeting to order at 6:57 p.m. It's a regular legislative meeting for Barberton City Council. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by Mr. Griffin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Bow our heads, please. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and the opportunity to serve this community. Give us wisdom and knowledge to be fair and impartial. Protect all our first responders, our men and women, and our armed services. In your blessed name, let us say amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Heineck.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey.
Here.
Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Here.
Mrs. Frye.
Here.
Approval of the minutes. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, October 23, 2023. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, October 23rd, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes from Monday, October 23rd, 2023.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on October 23rd, 2023 as presented. All those are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Approval of the minutes of the executive session held on Monday, November 6th, 2023. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the executive session from Monday, November 6th, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes from the executive session held on Monday, November 6th, 2023.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the executive session held on Monday, November 6th, 2023 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The minutes are adopted. Petitions and claims?
We have none.
Matters requested?
They've all been dispersed.
Thank you. Citizens addressing council? There were none. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Resolution number 142-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, Commendation, Coach Tony Gatto. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to Coach Tony Gatto as being Barberton's winningest football coach.
Thank you. Just to confirm, there's no emergency wording on that?
No, sir.
All right. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule, as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter, be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do we know when Coach is going to be able to come in?
I never call the schedule till after it's been passed.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was just asked before this, so.
Thank you.
Yep. Are there any other remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Resolution 142-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to adopt resolution number 142-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 143-2023, presented by Mr. Hyden. Title, Transfer of Funds, Law Department. An ordinance transferring $60,000 from the income tax fund to the unappropriated item of the general fund and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 143-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 143-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 144-2023, presented by Mr. Hyden. Title, Appropriation, Law Department. An ordinance appropriating $60,000 from an unappropriated item of the general fund to the Law Department's operation and maintenance budget and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 144-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 144-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 145-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, Application for Federal STBG, TASA, and CRP funds. A resolution allowing the mayor to apply for Federal Surface Transportation Block Grant, STBG, Resurfacing Program Transportation Alternative Set Aside, TASA, and Carbon Reduction Program, CRP, funds program by the Akron Metropolitan Area Transportation Study, AMATS, to improve the following streets and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and second by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Resolution 145-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and second by Mrs. Bailey to adopt ordinance number 145-2023. Are there any remarks? Oh. All righty. We'll step back and say this again. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to adopt resolution 145-2023. Thank you, Lori. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
All right. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 146-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title: Enter into contract Regional Income Tax Agencies, RETA, legal program. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with Regional Income Tax Agencies, RETA, legal program for collection purposes and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 146-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 146-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 147-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title: Amending Chapter 880 Barberton Codified Ordinances. An ordinance to amend Chapter 880 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Barberton regarding municipal income tax.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second Mr. Heidick's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 147-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second Mr. Heidick's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 147-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 148-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title: Appropriation Fire Department. An ordinance appropriating $1,058.12 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the fire department's operating budget and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule Excuse me a second.
It happens. Telling you.
Thank you. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion for suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 148, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 148-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes. Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 149-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Enter into Contract Direct Indictment Program. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with the Direct Indictment Program of Summit County in the amount of $21,000 and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 149, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 149-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 150-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Appropriation Law Department. An ordinance appropriating $22,064 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the law department's operation and maintenance budget and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 150, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 150-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 151-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Authorized Payment Direct Indictment Program. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to the Direct Indictment Program of Summit County in the amount of $22,064 and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 151, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 151-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 152-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Appropriation Police Department. An ordinance appropriating $148,000 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the police department's personnel service budget of the general fund and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 152, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second Mr. Heidick's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 152-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 153-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Enter into Contract, Summit County Health. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into a one-year contract with the Summit County for the Summit County Health Connection for employee benefits, which include medical and prescription coverage beginning January 1, 2024 through December 31st, 2024, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 153, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 153-2, or 2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
This ends the first reading.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 141-2023, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Zoning Map Amendment, former Oakdale site. An ordinance denying the rezoning of the former Oakdale site, parcel number 011 17406, 01174070, 01174008, 01174009, 01174010, 01174011, 01174012, 01174013, 01174014, 01174015, 01174016, 01174017, 01174018, 01174019, 01174020, and 01174021 to RM18 residential multifamily. This is the second reading. The first reading was on October 23rd, 2023, and the third and final reading will be on Monday, November 27th, 2023. This ends the second reading.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Resolution number 129-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Grant Application. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton supports and authorizes the mayor to apply to the Barberton Community Foundation for a grant in the amount of $1,600,000 annually for 25 years. This is the third reading. The first reading was on October 9th, 2023, and the second reading was on October 23rd, 2023.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt Resolution 129, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
I won't second it.
Mrs. Thompson?
Can I make a remark first, or should I?
Make the motion and then you can make a remark.
Okay. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to adopt resolution number 129, 2023.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Coburn to adopt resolution. Thank you. Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to adopt resolution number 129-2023. Are there any remarks? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you. I wanted to go ahead and motion to second that because I think we should start over. I think we need to go back to the drawing board, and voting on this tonight, I don't think it's something that needs to be rushed. This is such a big project, and we can have discussions with the foundation and come up with a better game plan. So I will not be supporting this evening, but I don't think it hurts to just put it to a vote and get rid of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there?
No, because it's third reading.
Are there any other remarks? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. In the finance over 25 years, anything less than the 1.6 million would be an undue burden on our residents, our businesses through their water and sewer bills, and our general fund. As the numbers go up, the number goes down general fund, yet still hits our enterprise funds. Being the third reading, there has been 6 weeks of discussion. I have not seen any counter from the foundation. I have not seen any offer of a date for them to meet us here in council chambers, only that they had prior commitments on the dates I offered. Furthermore, the answer of the 20 million is a one-time from Director Flaker is something that could be entertained in the future. However, I have to ask, if true that they have to book the amount in the first year, if it's financed, and a minimum of 600,000 would equate to 15 million a year, or 15 million booking in that first year. My question is, why did this request even come to us in the first damn place? If the foundation wasn't going to sit down and talk to us, why did the request even come to the desks? Why was it even a thing? That's why we're here today, because when the mayor gave his presentation, and Mayor, I give you all the credit in the world, that couldn't have been easy coming up with a formula based on a minimum of 600,000. That had to be hell to go through to figure out each nuance there. But at the same time, that nuance, we have to use 600,000 as a placeholder because that's the only concrete number there is. And to put our citizens at risk of having to subsidize without their vote, without our vote, to me is still immoral, it's unethical, and there is no way I can support upping what's already a burden on some residents for what we all know we need. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. Is there any other remarks? All right, clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
No.
Mrs. Thompson,
No.
Mrs. Bailey,
No.
Mr. Griffin,
No.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
No.
Mrs. Angela.
No.
6-2.
Yeah, motion for adoption fails. 2 yea, 6 nay.
This ends the third readings.
All right, appointments.
To the City of Barberton's Board of Zoning and Appeals, Mr. Chad Klein, for a term beginning January 1st, 2024, for a 6-year term ending 12/31/2029.
Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Klein? Mrs. Thompson?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we appoint Mr. Chad Klein to the Board of Zoning and Appeals.
Thank you. Mrs. Angela?
Yes, I will second that appointment for Mr. Klein to the Board of Zoning
Thank
and
you.
Appeals.
A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mrs. Angela to appoint Mr. Klein, or Chad Klein, to the City of Barberton's Board of Zoning and Appeals. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries for the appointment.
To the City of Barberton's Board of Zoning and Appeals, the appointment of Antoinette James Carter to begin January 1st, 2024, for a 6-year term ending December 31st, 2029.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to appoint Mrs. Carter? Ms. Carter. Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Mrs. Antoinette James Carter to the Board of Zoning and Building Appeals.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion to appoint Antoinette Carter to the Board of Zoning and Appeals.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to appoint Mrs. Antoinette James Carter to the City of Barberton's Board of Zoning and Appeals. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries for the appointment.
The City of Barberton's Board of Zoning and Appeals, Mr. Gary N. Kelly, to begin January 1st, 2024, for a 6-year term ending December 31st, 2029.
Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Kelly? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to motion to reappoint Gary Kelly to the Board of Zoning and Building Appeals.
Thank you. Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President, and I will second the motion to appoint Gary Kelly to the Board of Zoning and Appeals.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angela to appoint Mr. Gary N. Kelly to the City of Barberton's Board of Zoning and Appeals. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries for the appointment.
To the City of Barberton's Design Review Board, Mr. Willie Jenkins, to begin January 1st, 2024, for a 6-year term ending,
That's wrong.
this is wrong, December 31st, 2029.
Alrighty. Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Jenkins? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make a motion to appoint Willie Jenkins to the Design Review Board. I'm going to say beginning January 1st, 2024, ending 12/31/2029.
Yep. Thank you. And Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to appoint Willie Jenkins to the Design Review Board.
All right. Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to appoint Mr. Willie Jenkins to the City of Barberton's Design Review Board. Are there any remarks? Mrs. Thompson?
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
Mr. Worsler, is this supposed to be a 6-year term for Design Review Board?
4. Is it 4?
That's what I thought.
That's what I
Four.
thought. Let me reread.
Can
it.
I,
I'll reread it and we'll just do it all over.
It's a simple vote,
Thank
so we'll do
you.
that.
Sorry about that.
No, thank you. So it is to the 29th, wait, 24.
24,
BZBA
25.
is the only one with a 6-year.
Right,
Okay,
If
so
I-
it's 27, correct?
yes.
Okay. The City of Barberton's Design Review Board, Mr. Willie Jenkins, will begin January 1st, 2024 for a 4-year term beginning January 1st, 2024, ending December 31st, 2027.
All right, thank you. Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Jenkins?
Okay, we'll try that again.
Mrs. Thompson.
I will motion to appoint Willie Jenkins to the Design Review Board for a 4-year term beginning 1/1/2024.
Thank you. Mrs. Angelo?
And I will second that appointment to the Design Review Board to Willie Jenkins.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to appoint Mr. Willie Jenkins to the City of Barberton's Design Review Board. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
These are wrong.
Planning, is that 6 years?
Motion carries for the appointments.
They're
That
wrong.
needs to be changed.
BZBA is
City of
the
Barberton's Planning Commission, Mr. Keith Halcom, to begin January 1st, 2024 for a 4-year term ending December 31st, 2027.
Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Holcomb? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to motion to appoint Keith Holcomb, reappoint to the Planning Commission beginning 1/1/2024 for a 4-year term.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angelo?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion to appoint Keith Holcomb to the Planning Commission.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to appoint Mr. Keith Holcomb to the City of Barberton's Planning Commission. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries for the appointment.
City of Barberton's Parks Commission, Mr. Daniel Knorr, to begin January 1st, 2024 for a 4-year term ending December 31st, 2027.
Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Noor? Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, Mr. President. I make a motion to appoint Mr. Noor for a 4-year City of Barberton Parks Commission.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion on appointment.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mr. Heidick to appoint Mr. Daniel Noor to the City of Barberton Parks Commission. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries for the appointment.
To the City of Barberton Civil Service Commission, Mr. Michael Anderson, to begin January 1st, 2024 for a 6-year term ending December 31st, 2029.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Anderson? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to appoint Michael Anderson to the City of Barberton Civil Service Commission for a six-year term beginning 1/1/2024, ending 12/31/2029.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion on Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to appoint Mr. Michael Anderson to the City of Barberton Civil Service Commission. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries for the appointment.
That ends the appointment.
Miscellaneous and unfinished business.
We had a liquor license. It was a transfer, a C1, C2, to NAA Stores LLC, doing business as Doyle's Drive-Thru at 1087 Worcester Road North in Barberton, from Malka Drive-Thru Incorporated at the same address. There were no objections received and it was returned. No hearing requested.
Thank you. Miscellaneous and unfinished business. Anything from the body? Communication. I knew, Mr. Griffin.
I just want to say something about Veterans Day.
Yes, sir.
I want to thank you, the President of the City Council, and I want to thank the Mayor and Mr. Cheatham, Pastor Cheatham, for the wonderful service that we had honoring the veterans. And I'm a veteran myself, and I could relate to some of the things that Mr. Greer good to have that, the service over there. And I want to thank everybody that was involved. It was a wonderful turnout.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Is there anything else from the body? Just real quick, next meeting will be on November 20th, 2023. That's next week. I have nothing else. Communication from the mayor?
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to echo the same sentiments as Councilman Griffin. Thank you to the VFW Post 1066 and everyone else who attended the ceremony on Saturday. Change for Change will be this Friday at the Green Diamond, benefiting the Jack Reynolds Classic Stroke Awareness. I want to thank Council for approving Resolution 145, 2023, applying for the AMATS funding cycle. That just opened up. This is going to allow us to continue, allow us the opportunity to continue to receive federal funds for our roadways and our infrastructure. So very, very important there. As you've seen, some of the infrastructure projects, park projects, are wrapping up. Some of them may seem to be completed, but they may not be. Around some of the roadways, the barrels may be gone, the cones might be gone, but they're still, they can come around and put concrete around the manholes to kind of really secure those. But where there are barrels and cones and caution tape and things like that, please adhere to that, even though the project may appear to be completed. Those are up, the signage and everything is up for a purpose, so make sure you're still adhering to that. We will be working with the finance director, trying to request legislation again from City Council here in December for the street capital budget for 2024, so we can move faster on that as well. And then also in December, that'll kick off our 2-month collection of non-perishables and toiletries benefiting local nonprofits. And we'll release the collection spots or drop-off spots soon. So we've done this for a number of years, so we'll continue that as well. So any questions for me?
All right. Yes. I have to say this. I was at Anadine Park last night looking around, and it really was good. It's really nice. I want to thank the mayor, the parks people, and I want to thank everybody that's involved for running. I didn't walk the whole trail. I just walked enough to see. I love it. It really looks nice. So I want to thank everybody that was involved. That's in Ward 3, and it really nice.
So they're not done with that. They were up there today, kind of smoothing out the edges with some additional topsoil fill dirt. But we've got plans for more benches, new benches up there, trash cans, things like that, signage. So we're not done yet.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidick,
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adjourn.
is there a second? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion that we adjourn.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Didn't think so. This meeting is adjourned at 7:39.